Good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our discussion on the war in Ukraine with Anne Applebaum. I am Jim Hake, the founder and CEO at Spirit of America, and I want to thank all of our supporters who are on the call today, including members of our advisory board and board of directors. We are very proud to have you as part of our team and to represent you in the work that we do. For those who don't know, Spirit of America is a privately funded nonprofit organization, and we work alongside U.S. troops and diplomats all over the world to help them defend freedom, strengthen the front lines of democracy, and we work to show the world America at our best. We've been very active in Ukraine since 2014, and we understand that what happens in Ukraine will have consequences for generations. And our focus as an organization is doing things that will save lives and help Ukraine win. So since the beginning of the war last February, we provided tens of millions of dollars in assistance and hundreds of tons in assistance to Ukrainian special operations forces and territorial defense forces. Right now, we're in the midst of providing 1.2 million in vehicles to Ukrainian special operations, 2.8 million in vehicles and trucks for territorial defense forces, and about $500,000 in communications gear. And all that is citizen funded, and it's having an asymmetric impact in helping Ukraine win. So before we get to Anne, as a housekeeping note, if you have any questions today, please submit them via the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar, and I will do the best I can to get to them. But we're trying to squeeze about 4 days of excellent conversation with Anne into about 30 minutes, and that is it's going to be tricky. So as I said, we're very fortunate to have Anne Applebaum with us today. You can find her at The Atlantic and also in your favorite bookstore. One of our board members, General Jim Mattis, when I invited him to today's event, he couldn't make it, but he said, Anne is the sharpest one around when it comes to putting the Ukraine situation in context. So I think that's a pretty good endorsement, Anne. So to get things started, a question for you. You've written that the fate of NATO, of America's position in Europe, and America's position in the world at all are at stake in the war in Ukraine. So tell us why the stakes are so high.
So first, let me say thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be with this group. This is a great organization, and anything I can do to help it prosper, I'm happy to do. I think in order to answer your question, you have to start with asking why it was that Putin invaded Ukraine in the first place. And although he's given lots of reasons, different ones at different times, one of the most important reasons was that he wanted to show that he didn't care about UN charters, borders, laws of war, laws and norms on human rights, UN documents on human rights. What he was trying to do by invading Ukraine was show that none of that matters. He doesn't care anymore. Might makes right. And he can invade Ukraine because he's the stronger country and he's a sovereign country. Ukraine is not sovereign. This is some language that he's used in the past. And none of the rules that were set up to govern order in Europe after the war, after the Second World War, apply any longer. He's trying to undo the gains of 1989. He's trying to break apart the expanded Western alliance that was created at that time. One of his goals has always been to undermine NATO, to undermine the European Union, to undermine other European institutions, so that Russia can have more power and influence, and so that the world can be made safe for Russian corruption. And once you understand that that's part of what he's doing in Ukraine, part of why he invaded, part of why he has so consistently violated human rights, whether it's capturing and torturing Ukrainians or deporting Ukrainian children or attacking civilians. Once you understand that, you understand why it's really important that we help the Ukrainians win, we help them fight back, we help them regain their territory, and eventually in some form, we hold Russia to account. So this is about not allowing dictators to trample on other countries, to commit egregious human rights violations, egregious, with impunity. And it's one of the achievements by the end of this war, whenever it comes, will be to increase that sense that people pay a price for violating those laws and norms.
And how would you rate Americans and then American policymakers in terms of understanding what's at stake? And if we don't understand broadly, why not?
So I think the Biden administration does understand, and in a way, we're very lucky that we have this administration. Biden is somebody who actually had a long history of dealing with Ukraine, and he's also somebody who remembers the Cold War, so he has a sense of the importance of geopolitics, the importance of peace in Europe, why the European alliance matters so much to the U.S. economy and to the U.S. U.S. role in the world, why it's so important for the U.S. to have genuine allies, real friends who will help the U.S. In other circumstances and in other situations. They have been at times slow to move weaponry into Ukraine. Biden was very cautious, particularly at the beginning of the war, about not wanting to provoke Russia or not wanting to widen the conflict. And while actually I think that's understandable, it's become clear as the conflict has gone on that Putin doesn't have an incentive to widen it. He doesn't want to invade NATO. He doesn't want to, right now at least, he doesn't want to expand the war. Once we pushed back and showed him what the price for doing that will be, he came to understand it. And it also looks like, and we can talk about this, in a minute if you want, that he doesn't intend to use nuclear weapons. So once we understood that, then I think we could have been a little faster in arming Ukraine. But I think more, the Democratic leadership, the congressional leadership of the Republican Party have been pretty united and pretty clear in understanding why this is important. And I'm glad we have them right now.
And how about the American people more broadly?
So again, the American people, I think support for the war has gone up and down a little bit. There is a part of the public who are not keen on the war for a variety of reasons. Some have been swayed by Russian propaganda, either of the far right or the far left. Some don't like the cost, which is a fair question. The majority continue to support the war. I mean, the last figure I saw was still something like 70%, which is very high. And in supporting the war in the sense of supporting Ukraine and supporting Ukrainian victory and supporting help for Ukraine. There's been an amazing amount of support for Ukrainian refugees, which is, of course, there's often refugees are often less a harder issue than others. And I think that has held through. I think the better Ukraine does and the more Ukraine is seen to be winning or seen to be fighting, the more people have supported them.
And you mentioned that you think Putin has gotten the message in terms of his objectives that he would not seek to invade any of the NATO countries. And so if he were successful in Ukraine, where do you think it would stop? And is Eastern Europe afraid of Russia for a good reason?
I think, there's certainly an alternate history. There's an alternate scenario whereby we did not help Ukraine, or whereby Kiev did fall in 3 days, as Putin expected it to, and as many people in Washington expected it to. And had he taken Ukraine quickly, had Ukraine become a kind of Russian client state or Russian occupied territory, then yes, I do think there would have been immediate threats to Poland, certainly to the Baltic states, maybe to other countries on the borders of Ukraine and Russia. One of the things that Putin has done, and we can see this in the Donetsk and Luhansk, the territories that he took from Ukraine in 2014, is that he turns occupied territories into a kind of source for more soldiers and more colonial activity. And I do think there would have been a continuation of the conflict. Right now, it seems that it's hard enough to win for him to win and take territory in Ukraine, that he's not thinking along those lines, but he certainly could in the future. And I think one of the things the war has shown is that nothing's out of bounds. If he saw it was to his advantage to widen the war, he would. I think the show of unity that we've had from NATO, including this week, means that for the moment that's unlikely, but you can't rule it out in the future.
Well, and given his unpredictable aims and actions, or I guess predictable in the sense, as you said, that if it's to his advantage, he'll do it. How does this end? How does the threat to not only Ukraine, but Europe as a whole and the United States end with Putin? Does it require him to be out of power?
No, I think for this to end, I mean, and really end, not have a kind of ceasefire or frozen conflict that could reignite at any moment, for it to really end, Putin has to lose. So in other words, the Russians have to lose some piece of territory that's significant to them. Maybe it's Bakhmut, maybe it's Crimea, maybe it's some other piece of southern or eastern Ukraine. They have to begin to sense that the war is not winnable and that the war was a mistake. So in other words, they have to come to the kind of conclusion that the French came to in 1962 when they decided to withdraw from Algeria. They have to just understand that it's an unwinnable colonial war. And that can some people disagree with me, actually. I think Putin could make that decision. And as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, he's capable of justifying anything. I mean, he had an insurrection on his hands, and 2 weeks later he was meeting in the Kremlin with the leader of the insurrection. So if he decides to tell a different story about this conflict and to withdraw, I think he's capable of doing it. Obviously in the longer term, it would be better for us and of course for Russia if there were a different kind of regime, if there were a different kind of leadership in Russia, a leadership that put the interests of ordinary Russians first, and not the ego and the kind of imperial grandeur of the leader. But we're not, I don't think that's in our control, and I don't think that can be a goal of our activity in Ukraine.
Right. And you mentioned Pagosian and the revolt. Could you tell us what you think that was all about and what comes next from there?
I mean, so it's very hard to answer that because even people who know Russia very well don't really understand what that was all about. I mean, it seems that Pagosian felt he was endangering his power and influence, that his troops were going to be brought into the army. He seemed to have had, a legitimate or he believed he had legitimate complaints about the leadership of the Russian military. He actually said very interestingly, was very critical of the war and the reasons why the war was started. He implied that it was started because of corruption, because some Russian oligarchs and others in Moscow wanted control of more territory in Ukraine because they'd made so much money out of the previous conquest. So he had a series of reasons why he was angry. The bigger question is, why was it so easy for him to take over Rostov, which is the city that is the military, runs the military district in southern Russia. A lot of the war of Ukraine is being run out of Rostov. Why was it so easy for him to get so close to Moscow? And apparently we've learned in the last few days, why was it so easy even to get close to a nuclear facility that was between Rostov and Moscow? And why hasn't he been punished for it? And why has he not been paid some price for shooting down, I think it's 7 Russian aircraft, helicopters and airplanes? Those questions don't really have good answers yet. It's clear that the rebellion was unexpected. Putin reacted to it very nervously. He made a very strange and kind of anxious speech on that Saturday. The city of Moscow was shut down. People were building defenses around the city. And so there was a moment of panic inside Russia. It seems that Prigozhin himself made the decision not to go farther. Maybe now he's negotiating his future, and I don't think any of us really knows what that means. Nothing that's been said about his future or has been said about why the insurrection ended has so far panned out or proved to be true.
A question from one of our audience members. What are the prospects, in your view, for a negotiated resolution to the war?
A negotiation resolution is possible. The question, though, the question is there are two questions. One is, do the Russians want a negotiated resolution? Because right now they don't. So that's the first question. The second is, do the Ukrainians want one? At what point are they willing to stop fighting or give up territory? You could get a negotiated resolution. I mean, eventually there will be a negotiation of some kind. You could certainly get one after the Ukrainians have taken back a sufficient amount of territory, and the Russians then feel it's not worth fighting anymore, and the Ukrainians feel they've got control of most of their land and most of their population, because it's more about the people than about the territory. But you won't, as I said, you won't get to that moment until you have some some sense of that the Russians have lost and the Ukrainians have won. There has to be some feeling on the Russian side that it's not worth fighting the war anymore. So and unfortunately, I can't tell you when that will be, and I can't tell you exactly what that will look like. It could be quite soon. It could take a lot longer.
Can you provide historic context for where we are right now in Ukraine, going back both to 2014, 2015, the ceasefire agreements there, but even a little bit further back, if you will, so we can understand the conflict a little bit better in that regard?
Well, so I mean, you're going back to 2014 is important, because what happened after 2014 was the Russians did take territory. They took Crimea, they took parts of eastern Ukraine. Then there was a ceasefire and a kind of long, complicated negotiation between the two sides, but it didn't result in real peace. In other words, it didn't result in the Russians saying, okay, we're not fighting anymore, we don't need to take any more of Ukraine. And the fear that a lot of Ukrainians have is that if the war ends too early, if there's an artificially imposed ceasefire, or if there's some kind of frozen conflict, for example, that leaves the borders where they are right now, that would just mean that the Russians would go home, regroup, rearm, and invade again, in another 2 years. And so one of their goals in carrying out the current counteroffensive and continuing to fight is to, again, convince the Russians that it's not worth doing that the war is going to end, and that Ukraine is going to remain a sovereign country, and that it's not worth it. The Russians won't be able to achieve what they think they're going to achieve. And so that's why, the negotiation can really only happen after there's some kind of Ukrainian victory.
Right. Another question, what are the most valid arguments against a promise to admit Ukraine into NATO now or on a clear timetable? And why are they wrong in your view?
And there's really one argument against admitting Ukraine now, which is that the US administration and some others in NATO are worried that that would imply that there would have to be immediate US soldiers being sent to Ukraine to fight, because the whole premise of NATO really, really NATO comes down to one essential promise, which is that in the case a member is attacked, other members promise at least to try. By the way, there's no clear obligation, but they promise to come to their aid. And there is also an implied, the US nuclear umbrella is implied. So if one member is attacked with nuclear weapons, the US will respond. And the US is, and I'm just explaining this, I'm not advocating it, but the administration's fear is if they were to extend that now, then it would be, an implication is that they should go to war right away in Ukraine. And so there's never, I don't think anybody has expected that Ukraine would be admitted immediately. The argument is really over what the timetable should look like, when it should happen, and what conditions Ukraine has to meet. And one of the things that this NATO summit is going to do, I think, this is what's been flagged, although we'll see when they come out with the final statement. One of the things the summit will do is remove some of the intermediate steps. So there's a thing called a membership action plan that Ukraine may not have to comply with. There will be a further integration of Ukraine with NATO in terms of weapons and in terms of ammunition production and in other technical ways. There will be created a kind of NATO-Ukraine council that will facilitate, somebody described to me in Brussels last week, it's something nobody cares about outside of Brussels, but inside of Brussels it matters, that Ukraine is on a kind of equal footing with NATO. What the Ukrainians want is something more specific, like a timetable or a promise or some statement that when the war ends, they will be in. To me, it's obvious that having Ukraine in solves a huge geopolitical problem. It eliminates a gray zone. Once Ukraine is in NATO, then there's no question about which side it's on, or whether it's an empty space, or whether it has sovereignty. Then it's in, and that subject is over. Plus Ukraine now has certainly it's one of the top 2 or 3 armies in Europe. Maybe it's even the best army in Europe. And having Ukraine in is a huge advantage to the alliance in all kinds of technical ways as well. And so I tend to think that eventually that we will get to that decision, but for all kinds of political reasons, Biden in particular, and some others don't want to say that now. And there will be some in the next couple of days, lots of disagreement about how to interpret what the summit means. So some people will be disappointed, some people will be happy. But essentially what is happening is that the alliance is trying to find the words that says Ukraine will be in, but not quite yet, not while the war is going on.
And one more question on NATO. How important do you think it is that Sweden has been green-lighted to join?
I think it was really important. It was very helpful for this summit. It means that it started with a kind of positive and uplifting message, but it's also really important that, Sweden and Finland were already working very closely with the alliance, but having them fully integrated inside all the meetings is extremely important. They both have very good armies. They both have, military industries. They're both countries that care a lot about Russia. They both have a long history of watching Russia. They have a clear sense that Russia's on their borders. They feel much closer to Russia than most people think. We tend to think of the Russians being somehow close to Poland, and we forget that there are long Russian borders with Scandinavia as well, including with Norway. And so having them in, I think, will strengthen the alliance a good deal. It also will. It's very logical. It integrates the Baltic region in a logical way. It means that all the Baltic nations, including Germany and Poland, as well as the Baltic states and Scandinavia, are now part of one logical whole. And I think that will be very important just for thinking about geopolitics and thinking about responses to Russia in the future.
All right. So a comment that I'll ask you to comment on, and then two questions from different audience members. Comment is from our friend General Ben Hodges. He says the Ukrainian army is the best, all caps, in Europe. So that's I'll ask you to comment on that. The questions are, how is the counteroffensive going in your view? And could you comment on the administration's decision to send cluster bombs to Ukraine?
Yes, he's probably right, the best. It's funny, there isn't really even a contest because nobody else in Europe has fought a war anything like this in several decades. So Ukraine is certainly far ahead in this kind of war. It may not have all the advanced weapons that some other countries have, but it certainly has the spirit of the organization that really nobody else does. So Ben Hodges is right again on that. Cluster bombs, I have absolutely no problem with it. The argument is that they're needed because there are limits on how much ammunition is lying around in warehouses and can be quickly gotten to Ukraine. The Ukrainians themselves have been asking for them. There is an issue about clearing up after cluster munitions are used in the years to come. The Ukrainians say they'll take that responsibility. It's their decision. And I find that most of the arguments against it are kind of virtue signaling by people who aren't under attack. It's very nice for editorial boards of American newspapers to feel queasy about it, but if you were under attack by the Russian army, you would want to have whatever weapons you had to strike back. So I don't have any, I don't even really understand what the objection is or why it's taken so long. Counteroffensive is extremely hard for me to measure. The Ukrainians were very, very confident about it in March when I was there, and I talked to quite a wide range of people, including in the military and in the defense ministry. It's clear that the Russian defenses, including the minefields, have been harder to breach than some expected. And so the process is taking longer than many had hoped it would take. The Ukrainians remain convinced that once they breach the first lines where they think, many of the most important defenses are, that they will have an easier time of it later on. And I hope that they're right. As far as I can tell, they still have high morale and people are still, the training is going on. We also remember that most of the Western weaponry, the heavier tanks and heavy armor, haven't appeared yet. The Ukrainians haven't brought that forward yet. They're trying to break the first layer of defenses first before that happens. As I've written and as everybody keeps saying, I think President Zelensky said it a few days ago, it's not a movie. It isn't constructed for your entertainment. Had we been watching D-Day and the fight across France that followed it, hour by hour, scene by scene, the way we're able to watch the Ukrainian war, we would have felt that was taking a very long time and costing quite a lot as well. Give it some time and let them move forward, and until the end of the year, I'm hoping they can make some progress.
Well, we hope so too. Two questions related to Spirit America where I'd appreciate your advice. One is, as you know, in the non-governmental organization world, the humanitarian assistance world, there's a policy of neutrality where you don't take a side. And some philanthropists that we talk to question Spirit of America's assistance to Ukraine soldiers and ask us, well, what about the idea of do no harm? As though you can kind of be above the fray in a way. So what do you say to that?
I think this is a war in which you can't be above the fray. To be above the fray means that you accept the idea that Russians can invade their neighbor, take it over, take territory, kill civilians deliberately, arrest civilians, torture them, murder them, put them in concentration camps, kidnap their children, deport their children, send them far away to parts of Russia, remove their surnames often so that they aren't even able to get home. So if you are neutral in this conflict, you're saying that that's okay. And the only way to end that, this kind of horrific behavior, unprecedented in Europe in the last 60, 70 years, the only way to end it is for the Ukrainians to win and for Ukraine to fight back. And so by helping Ukraine fight back, you are creating the possibility of a better Europe and a better world, and even of a more lasting peace. And by refusing to help the Ukrainians, you are encouraging war, you're encouraging the human rights violations on a massive scale.
Well, Anne, we agree with that completely. And one of the ways that we try to talk about it to bring it home in a more personal way to people is, if in your own neighborhood, if the things were happening that you just described Russia doing in Ukraine, which are all true, from the kidnappings, the torture, the attacking of civilians and so forth, if it were happening in your neighborhood, what would you do about it? Right. And I think the answer to that is, well, you're doing it now, right? Because it's happening. It's not maybe in the same block over, but it's happening in the world, and we have to do all we can. So on that point, as I mentioned, and as you know, our focus at Spirit of America is helping Ukraine win. And in terms of what we can do and getting more people involved, what advice do you have for us?
I mean, the more you can encourage people to think of themselves as personally helping the war. I'm actually involved in a project that we raise money for to buy pickup trucks, used pickup trucks that you buy in Europe. They get repainted in Poland and they get directly to the front. And I found that people like the idea of giving something specific. We've got people to buy the pickup trucks and in some cases even to help drive them. People like the idea that they can personally do something to help the war. People feel very helpless, I think, when they just watch it on television to see terrorists happen. I mean, I think the more your organization can say, look, you're contributing to this positive things. Here's a soldier you're helping, or here's a unit you're helping, or here's a village you're protecting. The more you can personalize it, and the more you can get people involved in the effort to help people, I think the more you can do, the better you can do.
Well, on that point, one of the things that we've been doing is funding combat showers and laundry facilities so that, those on the front lines can take a shower and clean their clothes. And we had, in terms of making it personal, we had a World War II veteran say, I remember what it was like when I was fighting and I couldn't take a shower, and what it meant to me when I finally could. And so he funded one of the combat showers. So that's a pretty
that's great. I mean, remind people what it's really like to fight. What are these soldiers actually experiencing? What do you do every day on the front lines in Bakhmut or in Kherson? And I think, when people understand what it is that people have to do when they get up in the morning, I think they feel sympathy and want to help. Right.
Well, Anne, we're at time, so we have questions we couldn't get to. I'm sorry about that, everyone. But Anne, thank you so much for your time being with us today. It's really an honor to host you. We deeply appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for everything you do.
It's our pleasure, our privilege. Thank you.